Welcome to the Spaceship Earth mission log. I'm here with Stephen Bao of the Design Science Synarchy mission. And I'm delighted to have you here because, Stephen, you're the one who bridged me in, who introduced me to the world of the Buckminster Fuller Institute, the Spacecamp, and the Design Science Studio, which we're here to talk about today. And you are a phenomenal artist in your own right, and we've been doing a creative circle together around the artist way, and just had so many fertile conversations, so many fruitful explorations. You've been on my podcast, The Language of Creativity, and you're, like, to me, this amazing synthesizer of so many diverse sources of information, and you write them all down in such the most you assemble them together in a way that is so flowing and clear. I'm gushing now, so I'm going to stop. I'm really honored to have you on the Spaceship Earth Mission Log podcast. Welcome, Stephen.
Well, it's a pleasure being here. Thank you so much, Stephen, for that really effusive introduction. I've been privileged to actually get to know you, and it's just funny how we met through the liturgists, and it's that our religious backgrounds or upbringings is the commonality that brings us together, and that's kind of what I bring to the Design Science Studio, to a lot of what I'm doing in my writing, is trying to think how do the physics or the geometry that Buckminster Fuller often talks about connect to the metaphysics. And I feel like that's what Bucky does, is he is talking about geometry in poetic language. And it's a way of bridging the gaps between, well, actually, geometry is just another way of talking about the whole of the universe in a way that actually makes sense of everything. And when he's talking about love as metaphysical gravity, to me, it's just like, well, that's really interesting. That's something I can play with, that wordplay of he's combining things that usually aren't put together. And so putting metaphysical gravity together as a way to kind of like, let's forget about the baggage that this word love has. Why don't we talk about it in terms of the things that we can feel, and then relate it to that other inner sense of knowing there must be something more. And I think that's what Bucky's pointing to is, there's no difference between the physical and the metaphysical. One is just a metaphor for the other.
Yeah. Well, and, it's interesting, for those who don't know, the Liturgist was a podcast that bridged for a lot of people who were religious and who were no longer finding themselves agreeing with what they grew up with and questioning and having an expansion and sort of a losing of, a deconstruction of their ideals, and then a reconstruction process of those ideals. I love that you mentioned love. I love that you mentioned poetry and metaphysics. And, love is one of those words that has terrible baggage. And, it really it's misrepresented in our modern idea of love. Our society's kind of gotten confused, I think, about that. But in the same vein, art has always been a haven for expressing the nuanced and the hard to understand, and putting it into language and poetry that can encapsulate the essence of a thing, the metaphysics of a thing, the ineffable qualities, but that we all feel, we all know, we've all felt love, we've all felt the absence of love. And I think that's where, in the past, maybe spirituality has been the domain where religion or spirituality, where those ideals can be explored, the higher ideals of religion or spirituality, or why are we here? And I think we find ourselves in this profound moment in history where we're sort of realizing that things are moving so fast. Science has caused so much change and progression that is hard to keep up with. And so it's very important to keep up with the human soul and the inner workings of being human, and what does it mean to be human. And I feel like art has always asked those questions and also framed them in response to these changes and evolutions in society that are rapidly happening and often due to technology. And so you are featuring a project revolving around the Design Science Studio. Also an interesting interplay of words, design science. And I think now more than ever, those two things can go together, and the idea of art and science going together in a time where, where now we see things converging that used to be considered separate or in unmeetable. And of course, the Design Science Studio has a goal to revive Buckminster Fuller's idea of the design science decade. So that has been a big part of the work that was going on. And you were part of the first and second cohorts or coheARTs of the Design Science Studio. And then an interesting thing happened, and I want to ask you about that. But first, tell us about your project, the Design Science Synarchy, a little bit, and give us a framework for why you chose that as a mission.
Right. So because we were already in formation as a Design Science Synarchy at the time of the Trimtab Spacecamp, it felt like it might be a good time to actually bring this group forward as a way of thinking about, can we have a meta project that gathers together all of these specialist projects? Because it was really coming at the idea that Buckminster Fuller really talks about a lot, is this idea of education creating these silos of disciplines that don't talk to each other. And for Buckminster Fuller, the whole idea of education being separated like that just felt completely wrong, when what's necessary is a multidisciplinary gathering of all of these different disciplines together to actually address the challenges that we're facing. Because how else are we going to do it? We actually need to be generalists. And as children, human beings are naturally generalists. And it's going through the education process in our industrial society that actually seems to take the creativity out of people and exactly stamp them into clones of the kinds of factory workers that were necessary within the previous century, at the time when nations were starting to build up their manufacturing capabilities, and they just needed like laborers who could actually keep the factories running. But we're living in a time where that is not what we need, and we actually need to retool everything for the kinds of work that we're doing, and the higher education institutions really aren't serving that need. So the idea of a synarchy then would be to gather the collective intelligence of all of these different specialists into the generalist kind of perspectives that we need to have to be able to actually address challenges like hunger and poverty and homelessness, and even the whole idea of creating ways of learning in a self-organizing, collaborative way, rather than kind of this piecemeal working on only the specific things and then figuring out how they go together later. Buckminster Fuller was always starting with the whole, with the universe, and then trying to find what kind of principles and patterns can be derived from the amazing technology that nature already is. So we kind of do it backwards by going, okay, well, let's kill this thing, take it apart, and then figure out if we can put it back together again. Oh no, it's dead. So we kill the thing before we even have a chance to even understand what is nature, what is it actually doing. And it seems like that's what we're doing right now, is just realizing too late, oh no, we built 500 years of building this machine that actually takes things apart and looks at the pieces to try to figure out how they work, is actually the problem, and creating a cascading effect of entropy rather than actually integrating with the symbiotic, syntropic processes of life that actually brought us here. So I think creating a design science synarchy is kind of looking back at what Buckminster Fuller was trying to do. He was actually, the whole thing was a design science decade, integrating a comprehensive anticipatory design science process as a way of addressing all of these challenges and needs. And so his vision was, okay, we can do this in 10 years. This is actually possible, but there needs to be a really rigorous process to do this. So when I think of comprehensive anticipatory design science, for me, comprehensive is the universal principles of life. Anticipatory means that we have a sense of our current context and where we come from and where we're going. So the anticipatory is looking into the future at the particular problem of maybe a particular bioregion, and then going, all the solutions that we have available may need to shift according to the specific problems that are really at the core of what's going on within this particular bioregion, because there's a lot of different relationships going on here than there would be somewhere else. And then there's the design aspect is really human beings taking tools and technologies and then applying them to a particular need. And then, but that it's more on the process side of things, design being a process where we can take a look at the scientific method, but then apply it to, well, what are the objectives? What are the goals? What are the human needs that we're trying to address? And a lot of that comes down to understanding what are the values that we're embedding into our technologies through design, because design is kind of like a metaphysical process. It's in what I've come from as a designer of communications, websites, and now what we call user experiences with apps and websites is actually trying to think about, well, what is the experience that we're designing for? And if we think of Jesse James Garrett talking about the four different aspects of experience. It's perception, cognition, emotion, and action. So we're covering the senses, the mind, the heart, and the body, the holistic view of what it means to design for the human experience. But then now we're thinking, how do we go beyond that to think beyond the anthropocentric and then really bring in all of the living beings that make life possible on this earth because of the interdependence and interconnection of all of those relationships. And then we have the science. It's the, you have a hypothesis, you create an experiment, you create the prototype, and then you test it, and then you continually iterate on something that you can measure and quantify. But for me, the design part of things is this is the qualitative part of the process where you actually have to bring in, well, what is experience? How do you measure that?
Right.
A lot of that to me is pointing to something that is beyond the quanta or the quantum that we usually focus on as physicists or scientists. It's all about what can we measure? What can we create a repeatable experiment with? But experience is not repeatable. It happens once. You're in this present, and it's gone. And this is really hard to kind of disentangle from this scientific method. It feels like we need something else that integrates that, and a lot of that, I think, is what Bucky points to is, there's science, but there's also these generalized universal principles that actually point to something beyond a kind of set of values, metaphysics that the physical is able to help us create an interface for, but there's something beyond that interface that actually gives life meaning and order and life. It's coming from somewhere, but that's the thing that we're like, well, how's that working? We have no idea where that's coming from.
Yeah. It's like you can observe the frog in its natural habitat, or you could take it apart to see what's inside, but you really need to know both things.
Right.
And taking apart the frog, you kill the frog. And in taking the frog out of its natural habitat, you're not observing the frog in its natural environment. If you take it and put it in a frog case, a little terrarium, it's not going to be the same frog. So what I wanted to do was explain to people that the Design Science Studio, from designscience.studio, a Evolutionary incubator for art, inspiring a regenerative future that works for 100% of life. So this is the statement that talks about the Design Science Studio, and they just had a graduating cohort of 144 evolutionaries for the 2022 cohort. So I'd like you to walk me through what happened after the end of the 2022 cohort, because I think that's where this story begins with this mission. And also, what happened, and then you obviously can share who you were collaborating with at that point as well.
Right. So I was brought into the core team of the Design Science Studio at the end of the second cohort. And so that meant that I was doing some of the thinking around how do we think about our collaborative principles. And we would do little design sprints on weekends just to get prepared for what we were going to do at the end of the second cohort, which was put on this big event online to invite people to see what we had all been working on over the past year. And so Roxy Shohade is one of the founders and of the Design Science Studio. So she was realizing once we got to the end of that final event, we just needed some rest. And but then the next push was, okay, to be able to get into the third year or the third season, third cycle of the Design Science Studio, we're going to need some sort of funding model that is going to carry this forward. And we were looking into partnerships. Yeah. Something about that needed to wait until the summer to really get going. So there was this little window of opportunity that Roxy wanted to take. Okay, I'm going to fly to Europe. There seems to be this opportunity that I'm going to look into in Switzerland. And she asked me, can you help me with some copywriting? So we were busy working on some ideas just before she got on the plane to Switzerland. And part of what came out of that was this vision of what would we do if, one of the questions was, where would you start first from your personal perspective if there were financial possibilities on the part of cultural funding? And so I just made a list of, okay, if I was answering this question, what would I say for this vision that I have for what the Design Science Studio could be? And so, I mean, I could go through this, but what essentially happened was we just realized, oh, that funding opportunity it was the Migros Fund out of Switzerland. And we realized too late, okay, great, we can be there, but we know we're not actually even in the running for that kind of funding because the organization isn't based in Switzerland. So, okay, well, at least we've got some copywriting done and we have some ideas in the can for how we would pitch this to someone else. So Roxy ended up traveling to Spain, and that's where, unfortunately, she and Nico Alcalas and his girlfriend, Amanda Joy, were in a terrible car accident. So it was a head-on collision. The occupant of the other vehicle passed away. And the three of them in the other vehicle were rushed to hospital, and it was one was in a coma. Amanda Joy was in a coma, and when the other two were conscious, there was a recognition like, oh no, what are we going to do? Because the whole plan for the Design Science Studio was dependent on Roxy and Nico leading over these past 2 years, and we hadn't gotten to a point where we had figured out a kind of regenerative, self-organizing structure for the whole team and the way we're going to move forward.
So it was very dependent on the key people.
Exactly. Yeah.
That were the founders. Yeah. Which is a common problem. That's very terrible. I've heard the story about the accident before. It's a very terrible thing that happened. I'm sure a few people are going to want to know Amanda Joy. It's not Amanda Joy Ravenhill, right?
Exactly. Amanda Joy Gil.
Different Amanda
exactly,
Joy.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but still absolutely terrible. And so what happened after? Obviously, things had to pause after
Right.
that.
So the strange thing that happened was the Sunday of after the accident, I didn't know anything about this event. I had gone for a run and then injured my ankle. And I was just sitting there in the forest looking down at a creek wondering, okay, what do I do now? I just got to take a rest here, rest my ankle, and then try to figure out how do I get back home, just limping. And a hummingbird just flew towards me from the valley below and then just hovered in front of me for a moment and then realized, oh, I just had a big a burgundy sweatshirt or t-shirt on, and it must have been attracted by the color or something. But it
Thought
was
you were a flower.
It was a moment where I was just thinking, for some reason, about Psalm 23, and it wasn't significant to me until coming back to it later. I got a call from Mark Smith that evening saying there's been a terrible accident, and Roxy and Nico and Amanda Joy have been they're in hospital in Ibiza, Spain, and so at that point I'm thinking back to that moment and going, oh, this is the valley of the shadow of death. So it just felt like a very significant moment, that at the same time that I've injured myself, and I realized later I'm going to have to go through my own healing process. They're going through a major healing process. And something about that was just really resonant. And also very urgent about, what do we do now? Veronica Anderson and myself, being in the core team, we thought, okay, we need to do something to bring the community together, to let them know what has just happened, and then to at least kind of hold something together. And that's really where the Design Science Synarchy came from, was Veronica Anderson, Mark Smith, and myself came together with Claire Hedin. And on the Wednesday of that week, we brought the community together, and we were just actually surprised that Roxy and Nico were conscious and were able to be there at the event. And it was a really touching moment just to come together as a community in support of their healing. But out of that then came this realization that, well, we don't want to, we're in this tough situation where we could forge ahead and just do things on our own. But we wanted to be very kind of sensitive to the situation, trauma informed, and not usurping the hierarchy that was there in place. Nico and Roxy founding and leading this, the Design Science Studio. So the three of us, Mark, Veronica, and myself, just decided, okay, we're going to continue to meet together and figure out what to do. But it ended up just being kind of like a support group for the three of us, and then trying to feed information to the rest of the community. But making sure that Roxy and Nico and Amanda Joy knew that there was a groundswell of support behind them, and we were able to raise some funding for them.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
So
Wow.
I guess coming now to this, the moment when the Trimtab Spacecamp came around, there were some really amazing moments that we had just having these discussions together. And as we started realizing that things were turning around in the recovery process and we could breathe a sigh of relief, then there was times when we were thinking forward to, okay, well, what kind of experience do we want to invite people into? Can it be about play and creativity and really co-creating the kind of ways we want to be together? And so I have a lot of these sessions that we had done together recorded, and I've kept those private just because there's a lot of things that just we couldn't release to the public because it was very personal to what was going on within each of us. But there were some things that we really wanted to bring forward to the group, and a lot of that was just the founding principles of the Design Science Synarchy. It's really coming out of Richard Rudd in the Gene Keys, and I can read this out from the book, Synarchy, the universal principle through which collective intelligence naturally aligns itself in perfect harmony with all that is. Synarchy is the underlying nature of humanity that can only be known once it has emerged from the shadow frequencies. As the new collective consciousness dawns all across our planet, humanity will self-organize its creative genius and manifest the true higher purpose hidden in its DNA to bring about the new Eden, whereas the shadow consciousness manifests on the material plane through the principle of hierarchy and the gift consciousness through the principle of heterarchy. The Siddhic consciousness manifests through the principle of synarchy. So Siddhic being Siddhic. Cities are the transcendent manifestation of these universal principles.
Yeah, that makes sense. Wow. That's quite a quote, and I think very salient to this moment we find ourselves in collectively of like, it's Buckminster's quote, is it going to be utopia or oblivion? And there's not really any in between. And so how do we organize together as humanity? And that is one of the challenges that I think you had mentioned that you even faced within the Design Science Studio cohort, just the various dynamics that arise and challenges with having a group of 144 people, especially 144 artists. And how do you move everybody together in a common vision? How do you have all these separate projects and then present something unified that is of transformative value, that could be something that a philanthropist or somebody would be willing to invest in to say, this is helping move the needle on culture, on awareness, on people's perceptions of the world we live in and how we can impact it in a positive way, how we can work together, how we can do these design science changes in the world, and through art where it moves the heart, as you're saying, cohort. So tell me a little bit about that, because that is, I think the operative question. How do we synarchically collaborate together, and what does that look like, or what did that process look like for you in those meetings?
Yeah, a lot of it was a very personal process. I might also mention that Veronica Anderson also offers an ensoulment coaching process, and I've been engaged in that process personally with her since February of last year. So part of that was really addressing the changes that need to take place within the heart, within the inner architecture of each individual human being, that then gets built out into the outer world as architecture. So her focus, not only being on trauma and healing, it's also on understanding how there's a collective trauma that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And the way that we address that collective trauma is to understand that healing process as a way of really looking at where's the source of this trauma coming from. And it's doing the inner work necessary on the inner architecture that has a way of actually creating what grows out of that. So it feels like in the society that we're in, we do that in reverse. We create the architectures of our societies, and then we push people through them almost like we're extruding them out of a mold. And what it does is, because these societies have not dealt with their collective trauma, they're just creating more individuals who are being processed within this structure of trauma and perpetuating it.
And reinforced.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the reason I actually connected with what Veronica was doing was because her focus was on this process of understanding that there's an inner architecture that out of which everything else grows. And when we create our architecture, what we're really doing is enforcing through solid objects and tools and systemic processes as well, the way that society works. And it is its own kind of self-generating, automating machine in a way of creating more of the same. If we do that without, we think we're just creating products, but we're actually creating ourselves in this process of creating architecture. So if we do it in a really mindful way of starting with the inside and then growing outward in the same way that nature does, I think that's what Bucky was pointing to, was there's something behind all these artifacts. There are universal principles that nature is growing out of, and out of these principles, we can actually glean from the architecture of nature what's actually happening. There's a symbiosis and a synergy that's happening as there's these interdependent relationships that are creating this whole phenomenon of life. And when we start to create things in an anthropocentric way, well, we're only going to create architecture that serves human beings. We have this effect of actually creating systems that are maybe making it possible to serve the needs of human beings for a time, or maybe even only specific human beings that are at the top of the hierarchies that these systems serve. But if we extrapolate from here, what's going to happen to systems that are always looking for endless growth and endless production? You're going to meet the limits of what the planet can actually support. And that's what we're we're recognizing now in real time we're hitting those limits.
Right.
So when we realize that we've created an entropic machine, we have to actually go back and start observing, well, what is nature doing to create this syntropic organism? And that's going to be the crucial difference in the way we actually start to reimagine the way we move forward. It's by recognizing hierarchy is not going to get us there. Synarchy is the way we need to think about reorganizing ourselves in a way that is self-organizing and symbiotic with all the other living processes of the planet. So the measure of that system becomes life rather than money or profit or
certainly
specific resources that we've applied a certain monetary value to.
Well, it's great that you say that when you answer the question, you say, well, it started for me with the inner work. I think a lot of people are realizing that that's so crucial. And also you mentioned a wounded society that's extruding people who are wounded. It's creating more wounding. And you mentioned hierarchy versus syntropy or synergistic organization. It makes me think of the flower of life. You have Buckminster Fuller's spheres behind you. And the flower of life is very similar in that it's the circles overlapping. And so it's like the mesh net instead of the one centralized server that's serving everything. And I think there's a ripple effect that happens when you are the best you can be, and you've done the inner healing work, and you're therefore a person who knows how to heal. You bring that sense of healing wherever you go, and also this sense of wellness and that sense of joy and that sense of stability, and you bring that into whatever group that you're in. And so to have redundancy on the resilience, it takes the load off the node. Right. So in the case that you were talking about with Roxy, you have somebody who's spearheading things, and I think that's very important to be the initiator, but there always becomes a point in a very large venture, especially when you're working with so many people, where there's a lot of push that has to come from the leader, and that leads to burnout. So just like you mentioned the planet reaching the limits of its resources, I feel like leaders and individuals also reach their limit of their resources. And then we go looking for funding, because we look at the monetary relief of, if we had funding, then we could get some help or some relief or some amplification in the message and some support systemically and otherwise, forgetting that, that's important. And it's one of the forms of capital, but also at the same time, that sort of lattice work of interlocking people bringing their best selves to the picture, and how that community can support. And that's more of the weaving, for lack of a better term, people call it more of the feminine way of groups, is, this sort of circle and the supportiveness of, a group together and carrying each other's burdens and helping to form a community versus like a hierarchy, as you said. And not that there's not a place for hierarchy, but we're definitely seeing the dark side, the shadow side of that, as you mentioned in the quote that you read about the gene keys, which was that, humanity is currently facing its own shadow as well in very large degree. And so, so I want to touch on something that you and I have talked about before in regard to you sprained your ankle and you had to recover, and simultaneously the group had to pause. It was like we're about to do this big push, let's get funding, let's get ready for the next one. There's all this momentum of 2 cohorts. We're going to do the third. We have all these events, and then suddenly there's this giant exhale. It's a pause of, we can't move forward right now. That would not be the right thing to do. and sort of the reminder of the hummingbird coming up, and suddenly you weren't walking through the valley. You're a flower. You're planted there on the ground, and you're there by the water, and by the still quiet waters. And tell me a little bit about that, because I know that you've been doing some work around the calendar,
Right.
and the solar calendar and the moon cycles, and sort of this rewilding approach to time and how we apply our efforts and work with nature instead of against it. I'd love to dive into that topic.
So there was another thing that happened that morning that I injured my ankle. I actually sent a note to Veronica that I had been listening to a podcast episode of from Plum Village, based on the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, and so they have a podcast called "The Way Out Is In," and so I was listening to this episode that was had this key idea that just leapt to my attention. And it was slowing down, resting, and healing is our gift to the world. I'm like, that's really interesting. So I just sent that to Veronica that morning before I went for the run. And little did I know that I would actually be living that out. And it was actually something that I brought up on that Wednesday when we had the Design Science Studio gathering in support of Roxy, Nico, and Amanda Joy. That slowing down, resting, and healing is our gift to the world. And it really resonated with people. So then going back to those things that I wrote for the Migros fund, I'm having chills just thinking about it. Maybe I can. It wouldn't take much to just read it through, but
go ahead.
It applies. So. Here's what I was proposing. We would, if we had this amazing funding, this is what we would do. We would build a team to help onboard a group of highly sensitive, emotional, intuitive, and creative people in a nurturing space for growing a resilient, healthy, supportive, and collaborative community. The Design Science Studio would be nurtured as a community to be a prototype of a social organization based on regenerative principles, inspired by the complexity, the diversity, the resilience, and the self-organizing and reproductive capacity of living organisms. We would, maybe I'll add this too, while Project Drawdown focuses on the most effective ways of mitigating the destructive effects of climate change, the Design Science Studio focuses on the creative capacity, energy, and agency of a network of highly motivated individuals to become a self-organizing learning community. We would connect local bioregions into a global network of regenerative practitioners to share tools and resources for a movement that integrates the development of inner architecture with our outer architecture. We would activate our spheres of influence from personal to local to bioregional to ecological to global as connection and conversation and relationships become the language and medium of regenerative cultures. Our problem is not a lack of solutions. Our problem is a lack of cooperative community with a shared intention to focus their time, energy, and resources on being a regenerative organism. We focus less on man-made technology to save us and focus more on nature's technology of consciousness, perception, cognition, emotion, and action to live in symbiosis and harmony with nature. By slowing down, we allow nature to regenerate and we allow ourselves to heal. By slowing down, we can remember how we became the empathic social species that thrives on cooperation. By slowing down, we breathe in and breathe out and remember that we are not over nature. We are nature. We remember our nature as those who care for each other. By slowing down, we remember to care, to share, and to be compassionate. By slowing down, we create a culture of peace and love. By slowing down, we learn to navigate metaphysical gravity. So when I read this out to the Design Science Synarchy, Mark and Veronica, and I just went, well, those are our guiding principles. That's it. That's our vision. And
you wrote this before all that slowdown
exactly.
happened. It just before, wow.
So it was one thing leading to the next, leading to the other. Like, well, I could not have planned this. I was just writing this as copy, in June for something that happened at the end of July that then we actually lived out in trying to form ideas around, well, how are we going to do this? And then bringing this all back again, I was like, well, this doesn't seem like an accident. Seems like a lot of synchronicity and synergy happening. Yeah.
When I'm effusive about your writing, this is why, because you tap in and you also like pull together in such a way. And I love that you mentioned highly sensitive because I do a lot of work with artists, and I feel like that's where my experiences in starting my podcast about the language of creativity was starting out as a highly sensitive child and having to learn to navigate a world that I was the 80s when I grew up. It was action movies and skateboards and, horror films. And I mean, it was like totally the opposite of what I needed as a highly sensitive child, an artistic child. So I found music as a way to express my sensitivity and my noticing of the various colors and tones of emotion and life and experience and energy and all those kinds of things. And, it's one of the things that I think us artists know about seeing the layers and things, but also like it feels like no one else does. I think there's this feeling of like, and that's why there's so much, positive rebellion in art. It's like, it's shouting out from the mountaintops that which, you often struggle to say because nobody would understand or hear you. And the thing is that now we're in this moment where people are starting to soul search all around the world. And I feel like, the things that we weren't so concerned about as a general mass population 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we're now starting to become really acutely aware of because of the pain points that are in, which are the things that sensitives like you and I have always felt. Something's wrong here. This doesn't feel right. Why do I have to go clock in at something that isn't good for me to just eat and have a house and survive? This doesn't make sense. And so one of the things that never made sense to me was the 9 to 5. Oh, it's Friday, oh, it's New Year's. Oh, it's like there's this constant hustle, this constant push, this constant drive to move society forward, to keep going, to show up to the meeting, to go fly to get the funding, and oh well, the show must go on, so car accident here, well, let's figure out how to do it from the hospital bed. And one of the things that I was coming into contact with lately was this idea of even the celestial calendar. So people, obviously used to study the stars, and they created a whole zodiac around that with stories and things like that. Even the Gregorian calendar and the modern zodiac that people follow, it follows like it doesn't move with the stars anymore. So like the stories don't line up. So like if you look at like how the Gregorian calendar works, or you look at how the astrological calendar works, it actually doesn't line up with the stars anymore. Someone just decided, oh, well, we just want it to line up with this thing that's convenient, which means that the evolution, if you want to look at it from an evolutionary perspective, is no longer on a spiral. You don't have, like, obviously the moon cycles and the solar cycles for the equinoxes, they don't line up. They drift. And so that creates sort of like a constant like evolution and a constant motion of where things are lining up. And so when you're dealing with calendars and things like that, you're dealing with these cycles, and it sure is nice to have everything kind of every year line up on the first or on the solstice or whatever, but that's not natural. That's not part of. And so this idea that I came in contact with was, it's like we're stuck in a time loop, being on these calendars as systems that keep forcing us to, it's New Year's Day, and what are your New Year's revolution? Well, winter is not the time for the new year. Spring is. You know, winter's the time to hibernate and go inward and kind of like conserve your energy. It's not the time to be like, all right, time to hit the gym. So it's like, no wonder people can't even keep their New Year's resolutions, because it's not even in sync with our bodies and nature. And so if you go back to societies who observe even a lunar calendar and observe the cycles of the seasons, and they observe the summer solstice and the equinoxes, and there's a natural rhythm that evolves out of that is also very in touch with the human rhythm and the rhythms of the earth. And it's a slower pace. There are very long cycles to observe when you start to get into that motion. And so you realize, if I didn't get it all done today, there's always tomorrow. And, this may be like a 6-week process or a 12-week process or like a 6-month long process. And if I'm in process and that's something that I'm willing to observe my own rhythms and my own exhales, and those, it's like the Tao, there's not much to be done. When you realize that, everything gets done. So I just love that idea. So you worked on a calendar that is not a traditional calendar. It kind of looks like a circle that has the wavies around it.
Right.
And
yeah, so that project came out of another trip that Roxy took, which, people were going, you need to spend some time just focusing on your recovery. But she also had this sense that, well, I still want to do stuff. I'm feeling a little cabin fever, I think, but also probably also a sense of scarcity, right? Because, well, there's still a funding problem, and so she just needed to do a gig. So she went to Montreal, and she connected to a group called the Institute for Aliveness in Montreal. And what came out of that was an invitation to do a series of workshops on the winter solstice. And so I was one of the people that was invited to offer a workshop, and I'm like, okay, great, this is awesome. That there's something happening. We had Art Basel, where some design science studio people got involved, and this was going to be the first kind of like, hey, we're still here. We're bringing the team back together in a small way, and who wants to, raise their hand to get involved within this first kind of experiment back into doing some presentations online. And so I'm like, okay, what do I do? So because I was working with Veronica on my own inner work on meditation and figuring out my own schedule or plan for a meditation practice, I thought, well, what I'm learning from this whole process, this ensoulment coaching process, is that this society has desensitized me to my own senses of emotions, and I don't even know what other senses do humans have the capability of of being able to perceive. And when I was learning about how ancient navigators were able to, and even now you can talk to some Australian Aborigines and discover, oh, you can just ask them where's north, and they can just immediately point to where it is, or where they have an internal sense of the cardinal directions. And so that idea took me on a journey to try to discover, okay, well, what am I going to do throughout the coming year? Something about linear time was just not really sitting right with me. Just all these days and boxes and a grid that refers to some sort of schematic about time that is based on misconceptions about how time related to the birth of Christ and all the other sacred days that the church.
The fact that Octavius needed his own month.
Right? Yeah. So thinking that I don't think we have this idea of navigating time down very well. And my project for the Living Systems Collaboratory was to create a user interface for navigating metaphysical gravity. And I thought, well, where do I start with that? Well, I think it would have to start with our notion of time. The idea of a timeline just doesn't actually connect to reality. In what we're actually looking at when we're looking out into space is we see the points of light that are reaching our eyes, but we're not seeing the spheres of light that are growing out of each of these spheres that we call suns or stars. And so we're missing that the whole, emptiness of space, it's full of light that's going in every direction with all of these spheres creating waves across the entire universe. And there's so much that we're not perceiving there. So maybe thinking in terms of not in timelines, but in time spheres, we actually have to start thinking of time as a sphere. And that's where the calendar comes from is, okay, well, I've learned how to use Adobe Illustrator, so most of my work is going to be flat anyway, but can I at least point to there are spheres traveling around in elliptical orbits around a sphere, which are also spinning around other spheres in the galaxy and in the universe. Why don't we make that our conception of time and actually relate how our bodies are relating to all these celestial bodies in very intimate ways that we can actually feel and see and witness around us, like just watching the tides and realizing that's connected to the gravity of the moon and this relationship with the moon and the earth. And our spinning, the days are manifestations of a sphere spinning around a sun, and the tilt of that sphere causing or being the cause for the seasons. Why is that not the way we think of time? Because we've just made it associated with some sort of mechanical clock and how it's divided in certain ways, and those are really mechanical divisions. When we get back to like what I didn't realize, okay, I based everything on Kairos time, realizing there's a chronological time that's quantitative, and then there's a Kairos time that is about the opportune or the right time to do something. And I really wanted to get into that mode of not feeling like the scarcity of time was just driving me nuts. And
me too.
It was the source of so much fear and confusion around like, oh, I'm running out of time.
Constantly. Yeah. You're constantly running out of time. You never have time to be fully present in anything in this modern world. And it is so antithetical to being an artist.
Yeah.
That's what I've noticed. I literally had the same idea for a project. I wanted to, if I was going to start a mission, it was going to be around a circular calendar. And then you did it. And I was like, amazing. Like, I don't have to do it now. I'm really inspired by the work of Scott Thrift. And Scott Thrift is somebody who I'd love to introduce to the Design Science Studio and the Buckminster Fuller Spacecamp someday. Maybe he'll join. He is a terrific artist. And the first thing he ever designed, he was a successful filmmaker and editor in New York. And he realized that his time would just disappear. And so he decided to invent an annual clock. And the annual clock goes around one time per year. And a hand moves so slowly you can't see it moving. But then when you come back, you notice, oh, it's on a different color. Well, the colors of the seasons, and the colors are a gradient. There are no lines separating. And so none of his clocks have lines. He has a moon clock now. He's got a day clock that's 24-hour movement. And the thing that you realize is that it is a gradient. And that's the thing that I was, thinking about in my projects is like, we have this calendar that's in boxes and it has all these lines, but it doesn't tell you what is the optimal time of a day to, get up and move versus what is the optimal time of the day to rest. What is the optimal time when my creative cycles naturally kick in? What are the events that precede that? What are the triggers that kind of warm me up and cool me down from that? And so the same thing with you as an artist. I felt so constricted and limited by trying to shoehorn my life as an artist into my life as everything else I have to do to make the world go round. And in terms of like being a father and having work and projects and all these other things. And, often, as you know, being a designer, I feel like many people who are artistic end up in a field like design where you are now you're using your artistic ability to serve a commercial purpose and go into a corporate structure. And it's like fitting a round peg into a square hole. It just doesn't fit. Yeah. And it's so crazy making. And I feel like, one of the things that I've been benefiting from, not to like scare anyone off by me mentioning the zodiac or astrology earlier, but I have found that in my personal studies of doing a more meditative study of the lunar cycles, it can mean whatever you want, but the fact that you're observing that slower rhythm and that the month is not just this artificial thing where my rent's due, and there's all this pressure and suddenly you I gotta stress out and make this. It's like, no, you're actually on this rhythm where it's like you're noticing this gradient. You're being conscious of this slower movement of time. And you notice when the moon is full, you notice when the moon is in a quarter phase, you notice when it's a new moon. And there's sort of this like more gentle rhythm to it. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at with this idea of moving with nature and being at a tempo that works for 100% of life. I feel like that is an essential part of art. It's an essential part of community building, because if your leaders are burning out and, going all the time, it's going to lend itself to more reactionary decisions and more rigid, and more. There's just not that opportunity for things to emerge, for people to come online and support, and for people to be included. And there's just a certain pace that I think leaves people behind. And that's the world that we've inherited, that world that's been created by design or by unintentional design, or, maybe it's, but yeah, I mean, we've got this 24-hour clock system that the day starts over at midnight when everybody's sleeping. And it's like, just so that it's the next day when you wake up, but it doesn't make any sense. Like, it's not, it's not helpful. And, like the thing that got me was, and I was going to bring this into the project if I started the project, was my wife showed me this video that I think Vox did that was about rhythm, a different way to view rhythm for music. And instead of doing rhythm like quarter notes on a page or eighth notes or dotted eighth note and half note, whatever, it was circles. So each beat was the top of the circle, and wherever you put the subdivision in the circle, it would come around. That, or you could even swing it. Right? And so suddenly there was this whole new way to view the rhythm of music. And I was like, that makes so much more sense to me. And then you take the idea of the circle and you just go, well, if you want to chart that out on a straight line, a circle is just a sine wave. You take the circle, the circular motion, and then it's going up and then down and then up and down. That's literally the one-dimensional plot of a two-dimensional circle. And I was suddenly like, wow, this is so much more intuitive and so much more real and organic and helpful. And it's like, could we figure out how to move more in harmony with the rhythms of ourselves, the rhythms of each other, and ultimately to allow, that flower that only blooms a certain time of the year to not get cut down because it's not blooming right now and we want it to bloom. And so we're going to plant a different flower. It's like, no, that flower is in its process. And it's like, the seed in the ground is still doing something. Even if it seems to be doing nothing, it's doing something. That time when the DSS had to go into a deep inner phase of stillness, that stillness is not doing nothing. It's quite the opposite. And so I'm just so excited that you go check out his calendar. The blog is, what was the blog for that called?
I've called it the Apocrypha because it's about everything that's outside of the canon of the orthodoxy, whether it's the religious orthodoxy or the scientific orthodoxy or the economic orthodoxy. I
think we pretty much just went to all those places just a minute ago.
Pardon me?
Never mind. I was just saying we probably went outside of all those orthodoxies just a minute ago.
Probably, yes.
So the Apocrypha, yes. Yes.
But it's actually also to mean when you're creating a codex that has a limited number of pages, because this is a new technology. So it used to be the papyrus scroll. And so, for example, Luke and Acts were actually the same book, but they had to split it into two scrolls. So,
oh, really?
Apparently, according to, I think it was John Dominic Crossan on Homebrew Christianity, I think it was, but...
That's huge. That's huge because those are two books that, you have one that's in the Gospels, the 4 books of the Gospels, and then you have this other thing that's kind of after the Gospels, and we think of them as completely separate books in Christianity.
But if you look at them, they're both addressed to Theophilus, and so there's the common theme of Luke is telling the story, and so anyway, that to say, when you have as an empire, you're trying to figure out, okay, we've got this new technology called a codex, and we can, put pages within this book, but there's only a certain number that we can fit in here. So what are the books that we can fit? So when we come across the printing press and then go, okay, we're going to create a Bible. This is going to be the book. That's at the point where they were going, okay, the Roman Catholic Church thinks that there's all these books that are questionable. to our theologies, and like doesn't mention God, doesn't mention the Holy Spirit or anything like that. Why are we including these books? Maybe we'll add them to the Apocrypha. and those can be like the optional, and there's others that just didn't even make the cut. Like, no, those are definitely heretical. Anyone who's reading those should be burned with the books themselves. And
the books is kindling.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sad to think back to that.
Yeah. And that, to me, it seems very interesting to me that like a council of men come together to start to decide what's in and what's out. And for me, that just means like, well, all of my experience as a human being is just being left out of the canon of what people think is important. Well, I think it's important. So I'm just going to call it the Apocrypha, just to say, like, I'm not adding to your canon. That would be, heretical. But I can add as much as I want to the Apocrypha and no one's going to blink an eye. So I'm just going to call what I'm doing just like way out of the realm of what people are looking for as, the expected, and just creating on the fly in real time out of my human experience of being a medium of life. And so if nature feels like whatever, well, this is the way I'm thinking about time. Time is like coral. It grows spherically, structure. The lives of the coral that are creating, the actual lived experience of being a coral are the little beings that are creating the structures that grow out of that, in the same way that trees are doing the same thing.
Incredible.
There's a kind of outer edge that is the life of the tree, but the inner core is really just like the physical structure that's being left behind by the life that then becomes the substrate for the living cells of the,
and it causes so many other members of the ecosystem to flourish,
right,
in leaving its artifact of its just being.
Exactly. And so humans do this same sort of thing, but we're able to create tools and architecture, and so a lot of what we're creating is inorganic. It doesn't have the ability to decompose very easily and become part of the living cycle. So is there a way that we can do that differently? So that brings us back to the calendar. You were talking about senses, and that was my project or the workshop that I was offering with the Institute for Aliveness and the Design Science Studio was, can we grow senses for co-creation? If we're going to be a synarchy, we actually need to be able to sense what's going on and to be able to communicate, what do we actually need to pay attention to? And so it's getting into those rhythms of life that are connected to our bodies being connected to all these, the large celestial body that we're already on, and all the other bodies that we're integrating with on this planet, but also the other celestial bodies that we are intimately connected with, the sun, the moon, and all the other planets do have some sort of effect on what's happening here. And if we trace everything back through time, like, everything has a place, and we're now using the James Webb telescope to look back at the first billion years of the existence of the universe, because now our perception has been opened up that much wider because we have that level of precision in our ability to use technology to see. So what if we did that as nature, as living beings who have other desensitized senses? How do we get to know those senses again? And so I came back to the idea of, well, we grow artifacts in the past, and that's kind of what the masculine looks at. It's the body and the mind are all pointed towards, like, how do we perceive the past? And the body stores everything in physical matter, and the mind is processing events that have already happened and then interpreting them into a story. But what we often ignore is the sense of presence, of just being alive and being able to experience the qualia of being alive, the qualities of life. And also just the ability to anticipate what's happening and realize that future is happening all around us and becoming present, and then getting solidified into some sort of past artifact, whether it's a thing or it's a thought or a memory. And so if we think of the metaphor of a tree, the roots and the ground are kind of the past. That's the layer of where everything is getting stored, or deriving our sense of identity is coming out of the nutrients of that soil. But the life of the tree is reaching out into the future, the air around us, and out of that interaction with the future is coming fruit, the ability to reproduce and create, and it becomes this toroidal field. So that becomes a richer way of thinking about time, rather than a timeline where we just go, okay, here's profit on one side and here's time on the other, and here's the hockey stick that proves this business is worth investing in. Well, that's a terrible way of thinking about time, because it's so two-dimensional. We live in a four-dimensional, at least, experience of being alive.
Yeah.
And the graph has, it just distorts our idea of time and what to pay attention to.
That would also explain why history repeats itself. Because every time the fruit falls from the tree and starts a new tree, there's a whole growth cycle for that. So if we could acknowledge that there is a growth cycle, there is an ebb and flow and a yin and yang and a day and night, and to all those things, we can be more conscientious, anticipatory design scientists by knowing that. Instead of going, oh, we're this straight line from Egypt to now, or from Göbekli Tepe to now, or from, how far we actually could go back. It's not a straight line.
No.
And it's actually not geographically either, because there are different groves, and there are there's the seeds that travel in the wind, and all these other geometries that we're ignoring. It strikes me to say, before we wrap up, in response to what you said about I think the Apocrypha, I think that's really important in the role of the artist, to be able to go into those spaces that are a bit unknown, a bit different, a bit out of the mainstream in a way, and sort of push things forward in society and to bring new ideas forth. And I think, to me, that's what artists always have done. They're always the forerunners. They have they have the senses and the awareness. They can feel it coming. They can feel, and so to underscore the importance of a group like the Design Science Studio and the work that the Design Science Synarchy is helping to support in the mission of the Design Science Studio, I would really love to highlight that one of the things that would be helpful is for venture capital to see the arts as a very essential part of the holistic picture. It's not something that produces a product like a carbon removal sink thing. What it does is it seeds the ideas and the senses and the sense awareness for the greater population so that they can appreciate that piece of art or be challenged or excited by it and be seated within them so that they also gain the awareness to maybe get inspired to invent their own thing that maybe is the more quantitative moving of the needle forward, as we like to say, moving the needle or changing, creating a change agent. But art in itself, if you look at music and the 60s, huge agent of change. But art is not always monetizable, in the ways that we'd like to think of it. So to understand that in putting investment into artists and their work, it is, sometimes a nonlinear, you have to give them a sandbox, and it's going to be, you don't know what's going to come out of that experiment or that, that R&D process, but whatever does come out, maybe it's not something you expected, but maybe it's really, really valuable. And so I just wanted to highlight that before we close and say, I will have another couple of sessions, I think, about the Design Science Synarchy, because I'd love to interview Mark Smith, and I'd love to do a couple more pieces about this, because I feel like it's so important. It's an incubator, the Design Science Studio. It's so important to this other aspect of what's happening in this broader world. And, I thank you for your presence and your wisdom that you bring to this whole group in general. Thank you for introducing me to a group that makes me feel like I have resonance and co-resonance and purpose and sharing. I guess it gives me inspiration. It helps me feel amazing about the future, knowing that there are other luminaries who are beaming, as Mark would say, a vision for a future that includes all of us and that is not just inclusive, but also practical. And so, Stephen, would you give me a few of your website links so people can find out more about you? I know there's about 20 different publications that you're writing at the same time. So just spout them off real quick. Where can people look you up and what should they be aware of?
Sure. At the moment, I'm focusing on the apocrypha.substack.com, or I'm gathering the communities together under trimtab.substack.com. But people can also find me at stephenbau.com or bauhaus.ca, builders.co, which is to do with the Builders Collective. So bldrs.co. And I think that's, qualis.life will get you to qualis.substack.com is something that I just started last week, just to focus on the difference between qualia and quanta. And another thing that came up earlier at the beginning of our conversation was just about book recommendations. So I just wanted to bring that forward, was just Jenny Odell.
Yes, please.
As an artist, is also a writer. And she's written How to Do Nothing, which is amazing. But her latest book is called Saving Time. And what I find just an amazing synchronicity is that I started this year thinking about Kairos time, and anybody who's reading Jenny Odell's book will realize that her whole introduction to her book, Saving Time, is about the difference between Chronos time and Kairos time. And it's, I could not have planned anything better.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. We could go on for hours, and I'm sure I will have you back, and you will have me back, and we'll do podcasts and all those kind of things. Please look Stephen up. His writing is truly inspired, and I thank you for all you do as an evangelist for the ideas of Buckminster Fuller, and as a community synthesizer and somebody who brings ideas and people together. I'm amazed by the number of times that you meet one-on-one with people to just share ideas and help them pollinate. So thank you for everything you do. Look up the Design Science Studio at designscience.studio, and we'll hear more about the Design Science Synarchy project. This is the Spaceship Earth mission log. Thank you for joining us. We're on Substack and on iTunes, and my podcast is The Language of Creativity.com. And I'm Stephen Levitt. Thank you for being here with us today. Thanks for being here, Stephen.
I'm so glad to be here.